Clash of the Titans 2010 brought together a wide ensemble of internationally recognized actors, combining rising Hollywood leads with established performers known for their work in fantasy, drama, and action cinema. The casting choices were central to the film's identity, as it aimed to modernize Greek mythology for a contemporary audience, while still maintaining a sense of epic scale and classical gravitas. Each major performer contributed a distinct style shaped by their earlier careers, and the film in turn played a role in reinforcing or redirecting their professional trajectories. One of the central figures of the film is Sam Worthington, who plays Perseus, the demigod hero at the center of the story. Prior to this role, Worthington was largely known within Australian cinema and television, with growing international recognition due to performance in Terminator Salvation. However, his true breakout on the global stage came just before Clash of the Titans through Avatar, where he played Jake Sully. That performance positioned him as a new type of action lead, physically grounded, emotionally restrained, and adaptable to large-scale visual effects filmmaking. In Clash of the Titans, Worthington brought a similar energy to Perseus, portraying a reluctant hero burdened by loss and identity conflict. While the film received mixed critical reception, it reinforced Worthington's status as a leading man in early 2010s action fantasy cinema, leading to additional roles in high-budget productions during that period. The role of Zeus is played by Liam Neeson, an actor with a long and highly respected career spanning decades before the film's release. Neeson was already widely recognized for dramatic roles in films such as Schindler's List, as well as for his commanding presence in action films like Taken, which had recently revitalized his career as an action star. His portrayal of Zeus relied heavily on his natural authoritative voice and screen presence, lending a sense of emotional weight and paternal conflict to the character. Neeson's involvement also helped elevate the film's prestige, as his reputation for serious dramatic acting added credibility to an otherwise effects-driven fantasy production. After Clash of the Titans, Neeson continued to balance action roles with dramatic performances, further cementing his unique position in Hollywood as both a classical actor and modern action icon. Opposing Zeus in both ideology and narrative tension is Hades, played by Ralph Fiennes. Fiennes, known for his intense dramatic range and commanding performances in films such as Schindler's List and The English Patient, as well as his later iconic role as Voldemort in the Harry Potter series, brought a darker psychological depth to the character. His interpretation of Hades leaned heavily into themes of resentment, exile, and divine imbalance. Fiennes used subtle vocal control and physical restraint to create a villain who is not purely evil, but emotionally driven by abandonment and jealousy. This performance fit well within Fiennes' broader career pattern of portraying complex antagonists who are both charismatic and unsettling. While Clash of the Titans did not become a defining moment in his career, it contributed to his continued association with mythic and larger-than-life villainous roles. Playing Andromeda, a key figure tied to Perseus' journey, is Alexa Davalos. Before this film, Davalos had gained attention through roles in television series and films such as The Chronicles of Riddick. Her career at the time was still developing, with a focus on genre projects and supporting roles in larger ensemble casts. In Clash of the Titans, her character serves as both a narrative motivator and a representation of human consequence within the divine conflict. Although the screenplay does not heavily develop her character, Davalos brings a grounded emotional presence that helps balance the film's mythological scale. Following this role, she continued to work in television and film, eventually achieving stronger recognition in serialized dramatic roles that allowed for deeper character development. Another major supporting presence is Gemma Arterton, who plays Io, a mysterious guide and immortal figure who accompanies Perseus. Arterton had already gained attention for her role in Quantum of Solace, where she played a Bond girl, and she was quickly establishing herself as a rising British actress in both commercial and dramatic cinema. In Clash of the Titans, her character functions as a narrative bridge between immortal and divine worlds, and Arterton's performance emphasizes emotional restraint combined with quiet strength. Her career following the film expanded significantly into both independent cinema and larger productions, where she became known for choosing diverse roles across genres, often favoring character-driven storytelling over purely commercial franchises. The film also features Mads Mikkelsen as Draco, a disciplined warrior who becomes one of Perseus' key allies. Prior to this role, Mikkelsen had already built a strong reputation in European cinema, particularly through Danish films such as Pusher and international recognition from Casino Royale, where he played the villain Le Chiffre. His performance style is often characterized by controlled physicality and subtle emotional expression, which translated effectively into the role of Draco. Although the character is not the central focus of the narrative, Mikkelsen brings a grounded intensity that enhances the film's ensemble dynamic. In the years following Clash of the Titans, Mikkelsen's career expanded significantly into Hollywood, eventually making him one of the most respected international actors in both independent and blockbuster cinema. In addition to main cast, the film includes several notable supporting actors who contribute to its mythological world. These performers help establish the scale of the story, portraying soldiers, gods, and creatures that populate the narrative landscape. While their roles are smaller, they are essential in maintaining the film's epic tone and reinforcing the sense of a living mythological universe. Overall, the casting of Clash of the Titans reflects a deliberate strategy of combining emerging Hollywood leads with established dramatic actors. This blend was intended to appeal to both younger audiences seeking action-oriented fantasy and older viewers familiar with the classical source material and the reputations of performers involved. Each actor brought a distinct professional history into film, shaping how their characters were perceived and contributing to the film's identity as a modern reinterpretation of ancient mythology. Clash of the Titans 2010 occupies an interesting place in early 21st century popular culture because it represents a transitional moment in Hollywood storytelling, visual effect technology, and a revival of mythological epics. While it was not universally praised by critics, its cultural footprint is more complex than simple reception metrics suggest. The film helped solidify a renewed mainstream interest in Greek mythology, contributed to the ongoing popularity of large-scale CGI-driven blockbusters, and influenced how studios approached fantasy adaptations in the years that followed. One of the most significant cultural impacts of the film was its role in continuing the revival of mythological storytelling in modern cinema. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, Hollywood saw a resurgence of interest in ancient myths, legends, and heroic archetypes. Films such as 300 and Immortals helped create a visual language for myth-based storytelling that emphasized stylized action, heightened reality, and digital environments. Clash of the Titans contributed to this trend by attempting to blend traditional epic storytelling with modern visual effects. Although its tone was more conventional than highly stylized counterparts, it reinforced the idea that mythological narratives could be commercially viable in the blockbuster era. The film also had a notable impact on the use and perception of three-dimensional cinema. During the production and release period, the film industry was rapidly embracing 3D conversion and native 3D filming following the success of Avatar. Clash of the Titans became one of the early major studio films to undergo post-production conversion into 3D in a relatively short time frame. This decision became controversial, as many viewers and critics felt the conversion lacked depth and clarity. However, despite criticism, the film contributed to the broader industry conversation about the future of 3D filmmaking. Studios became more cautious and strategic in how they implemented 3D technology in subsequent productions, leading to more refined techniques in later blockbuster films. From a pop culture perspective, Clash of the Titans did not generate a large number of long-lasting memes or viral internet moments compared to other films of its era. However, certain elements of the film, particularly the phrase, "release the Kraken," achieved a form of enduring recognition in internet culture. The Kraken itself, as a mythological creature, became more widely associated with modern fantasy audiences, partly due to its cinematic depiction in this film and its predecessor remake-era influences. The creature's portrayal as a colossal, god-summoned force of destruction reinforced its status as a modern symbol of unstoppable power in digital culture. The film also played a role in shaping audience expectations for fantasy action films in the 2010s. It reinforced the idea that audiences expected large-scale battles, heavily digitized creatures, and fast-paced storytelling. At the same time, it highlighted the risks of prioritizing visual spectacle over narrative depth. This balance became a major discussion point in film criticism during the decade, with Clash of the Titans often used as an example of a visually ambitious but narratively underdeveloped blockbuster. Historically, the film is significant because it reflects a period of transition in Hollywood production practices. The late 2000s saw studios increasingly rely on digital effects pipelines, green screen environments, and globalized production strategies. Clash of the Titans was produced within this framework, using extensive CGI environments to recreate mythological worlds that would have been impossible or prohibitively expensive to build practically. This approach marked a shift away from traditional set-driven epics toward fully digital world building. While this allowed for greater visual scale, it also contributed to debates about the loss of tangible realism in modern filmmaking. Another important aspect of its cultural impact is its contribution to the evolving image of Greek mythology in global entertainment. While earlier adaptations such as Jason and the Argonauts presented mythology in a more theatrical and practical effects-driven style, Clash of the Titans reimagined these stories through a modern blockbuster lens. Gods are depicted as towering, emotionally volatile beings, and mythological creatures were rendered with intense realism and scale. This interpretation influenced how younger audiences visualize Greek mythology, often blending traditional myth with cinematic reinterpretations. The film also indirectly contributed to renewed interest in mythological video games and fantasy franchises. During the 2010s, the gaming industry increasingly incorporated Greek mythology into major titles, such as God of War expansions and other myth-inspired action games. While not solely responsible for this trend, Clash of the Titans helped maintain cultural visibility for mythological themes in mainstream entertainment. In terms of societal impact, the film reflects broader audience desires of the time for escapist entertainment during a period marked by global economic uncertainty following the 2008 financial crisis. Large-scale fantasy films provided audiences with immersive worlds disconnected from real-world concerns. Clash of the Titans, with its gods, monsters, and heroic quests, fit into this pattern of cinematic escapism, even if it did not achieve the critical acclaim of other genre entries. In conclusion, the cultural impact of Clash of the Titans lies less in critical dominance or viral popularity, and more in its position as a representative artifact of early 2010s blockbuster filmmaking. It reflects technological ambition, industry experimentation with 3D, and the ongoing reinterpretation of ancient mythology for modern audiences. Its historical significance is tied to its role in shaping production trends and reinforcing mythological fantasy as a viable commercial genre in global cinema. The production of Clash of the Titans 2010 was marked by a combination of ambitious visual goals, tight scheduling pressures, evolving technology, and significant post-production changes that ultimately shaped the final film in ways that differed from its original conception. While the film presented a polished mythological epic on screen, the behind-the-scenes process was far more complex, involving creative adjustments, logistical challenges, and a rapidly changing approach to digital filmmaking in Hollywood at the time. At the center of the production was director Louis Leterrier, who had previously gained attention for directing action-oriented films such as The Transporter and The Incredible Hulk. Leterrier was known for his kinetic visual style, emphasizing movement, energy, and fast-paced storytelling. For Clash of the Titans, his goal was to modernize the 1981 original film and reinterpret Greek mythology in a way that felt intense, immediate, and emotionally grounded while still maintaining large-scale spectacle. He envisioned a world where gods and monsters felt physically present and dangerous rather than distant mythological symbols. One of the most significant behind-the-scenes influences on the film was the legacy of stop-motion animation pioneer Ray Harryhausen, who worked on the original Clash of the Titans, 1981. Harryhausen's creatures, created through painstaking frame-by-frame animation, had become iconic in film history. The 2010 remake sought to reinterpret those legendary creatures using modern computer-generated imagery. This transition from practical stop-motion artistry to digital effects was not just a technical decision, but also a symbolic one, representing the broader evolution of visual effects in cinema history. The production team was aware of the responsibility of reimagining creatures like Medusa and the Kraken, knowing that they carried strong nostalgic and artistic expectations. Filming took place across multiple locations, including studio environments in the United Kingdom and various natural landscapes intended to represent mythological ancient Greece. The production relied heavily on green screen stages, allowing environments to be constructed digitally in post-production. This approach gave the filmmakers flexibility but also created challenges for the actors, who often had to perform without physical sets or tangible references. As a result, much of the acting process required imagination and precise direction to maintain continuity of eye lines, spatial awareness, and emotional engagement. Sam Worthington, in particular, worked extensively within these green screen environments as the character Perseus. His performance was shaped by the need to interact with creatures and environments that would not be added until months later. This type of acting became increasingly common in large-scale fantasy and science fiction films of the era, especially following the success of Avatar. However, it also presented difficulties in maintaining emotional consistency, as actors had limited physical context during filming. The production schedule itself was relatively tight for a film of its scale. The studio aimed to capitalize on the growing popularity of mythological fantasy films, which meant that deadlines were strict and post-production timelines were compressed. This urgency would later become especially significant when the decision was made to convert the film into 3D after principal photography had already been completed. The conversion process required additional visual effects work and adjustments to framing, depth, and scene composition. The 3D conversion became one of the most discussed behind-the-scenes aspects of the film. Originally, Clash of the Titans was shot in 2D, but following the massive commercial success of Avatar, the studio decided to convert it into 3D during post-production. This decision significantly impacted the workflow of visual effects artists who had to reprocess large portions of the film under tight deadlines. Many industry observers noted that the conversion timeline was unusually short, which contributed to criticism of the final visual depth and clarity. Within the industry, the film became an example of the risks associated with rushed technological adaptation. Another major behind-the-scenes challenge involved the design and implementation of the film's mythological creatures. The Kraken, Medusa, and various gods require extensive conceptual design work before being translated into final digital models. Artists experimented with multiple interpretations of these creatures, balancing classical mythological descriptions with modern cinematic expectations. For example, Medusa's design had to maintain her serpentine horror, while also allowing for dynamic movement and action sequences within a confined environment. The lighting and texture work of these creatures required advanced rendering techniques to integrate them seamlessly into live-action footage. The film also had to manage the tonal balance between human drama and large-scale spectacle. The script went through adjustments during production to streamline character arcs and emphasize action sequences. This is a common occurrence in blockbuster filmmaking, where pacing and runtime considerations often influence narrative structure. As a result, some character development moments were shortened or restructured during editing to maintain momentum. On set, the atmosphere was described as highly technical, with large crews coordinating visual effects planning alongside traditional cinematography. Storyboards and pre-visualization played a crucial role in guiding the shoot. Scenes were often blocked out digitally before filming, allowing the crew to plan camera movements and actor positioning with precision. This pre-visualization process helped reduce uncertainty during production, but also required strict adherence to planned sequences. The film's cinematography relied heavily on digital compositing, with many environments created entirely in post-production. This allowed the filmmakers to depict vast mythological landscapes, including rocky cliffs, divine realms, and monstrous lairs. However, it also meant that the final visual tone of the film was heavily dependent on post-production decisions rather than practical photography alone. Costume and prop design were another important behind-the-scenes component. Although many environments were digital, the characters still required physical costumes that would translate effectively into CGI-enhanced scenes. The costume designers had to ensure that textures, movement, and materials would interact properly with digital lighting. Armor, weapons, and royal garments were designed to reflect a mythological ancient world while still maintaining a grounded, battle-ready aesthetic. Clash of the Titans, 2010, presents a mythological adventure narrative centered on identity, rebellion against divine authority, and the struggle between fate and free will. The story is structured as a classic hero's journey, following Perseus from a state of obscurity and personal loss into a figure who must confront gods, monsters, and destiny itself. While the film adapts ancient mythological material, it streamlines and reinterprets many elements to fit a modern cinematic pacing style, prioritizing action progression and visual escalation over strict mythological accuracy. The narrative begins with a framing conflict between the gods of Olympus and humanity. The gods, led by Zeus, have ruled over mortals with increasing detachment, feeding on human prayers and devotion as a source of power. However, humanity begins to lose faith in the gods, which weakens divine authority. This imbalance creates tension within the divine hierarchy, particularly between Zeus and Hades. Hades, god of the underworld, exploits this instability to gain power by instilling fear in humanity rather than relying on worship. This ideological divide sets the stage for the central conflict of the film. At the center of the story is Perseus, portrayed by Sam Worthington, a mortal raised by a fisherman after being discovered as a child floating at sea. The inciting incident occurs when Perseus witnesses the destruction of his adoptive family by a divine act of punishment carried out by Hades. This tragedy establishes his emotional motivation, a personal vendetta against the gods, and a rejection of his hidden divine heritage. As Perseus is brought into the larger conflict, he learns that he is in fact the demigod son of Zeus. This revelation is not only a narrative turning point, but also a thematic shift, as Perseus must reconcile his hatred of the gods with his own divine identity. Zeus, played by Liam Neeson, represents authority and paternal conflict, while Hades, played by Ralph Fiennes, represents betrayal and manipulation. These divine figures operate both as literal characters and symbolic forces shaping Perseus' journey. The central objective of the narrative becomes the prevention of the Kraken's release. The Kraken is a colossal creature capable of destroying entire civilizations, and its awakening is tied to political and spiritual collapse within the divine realm. Hades orchestrated a plan to unleash the Kraken unless the city of Argos sacrifices Princess Andromeda. This creates a ticking clock structure that drives the second act of the film, where Perseus is tasked with finding a way to defeat a seemingly unstoppable force. Perseus is joined by a group of companions, including Draco, played by Mads Mikkelsen, and Io, played by Gemma Arterton. These characters serve both functional and emotional roles within the narrative. Draco represents disciplined human resistance and military structure, while Io represents guidance, mythological knowledge, and emotional grounding. Together, they help Perseus navigate both physical and metaphysical challenges. The journey structure of the film follows a series of episodic encounters, each functioning as a test of Perseus' abilities and resolve. These include confrontations with mythical creatures, such as giant scorpions, and encounters with divine interventions. Each sequence escalates the stakes and reinforces the idea that Perseus is moving from human vulnerability toward heroic transcendence. One of the most important narrative sequences is the journey to the Stygian witches, who possess knowledge of how to defeat the Kraken. This sequence functions as a traditional oracle encounter, where Perseus gains critical information at the cost of confronting unsettling truths about fate and mortality. The witches symbolize the idea that knowledge in this world is fragmented and dangerous, requiring sacrifice or risk to obtain. Another key turning point occurs when Perseus acquires the head of Medusa. This sequence is both a literal monster confrontation and a symbolic descent into death and darkness. Medusa's lair represents a boundary between life and the underworld, and the battle requires strategy rather than brute force. Perseus must rely on indirect action, using reflection and timing to defeat her gaze. This moment marks his transition from reactive survivor to active hero capable of overcoming divine-level threats. The narrative structure then shifts into its final act, where Perseus returns to confront the imminent release of the Kraken. The tension escalates as Argos prepares for sacrifice, and the political and divine manipulation orchestrated by Hades reaches its peak. The Kraken's release functions as the climax of both the external conflict and Perseus' internal transformation. In the final confrontation, Perseus uses the head of Medusa as a weapon against the Kraken, turning the monster's power against itself. This resolution reinforces the mythological logic of the film, where divine and monstrous forces can be countered only through other mythological artifacts and interventions. The defeat of the Kraken represents both a literal victory and a symbolic restoration of balance between gods and humans. Following the climax, Zeus intervenes to restore order, confronting Hades and reasserting divine authority. However, the ending also suggests a lingering tension between gods and mortals, as Perseus ultimately rejects full participation in divine life in favor of remaining among humanity. This decision completes his character arc from unaware mortal to self-aware demigod who chooses human existence. Clash of the Titans, 2010, operates on a foundation of mythological storytelling that naturally lends itself to symbolic interpretation. Beneath its action-driven surface and visual spectacle, the film explores recurring themes of identity, power, rebellion, fate, and the fragile relationship between humanity and divinity. While the narrative is straightforward in structure, its thematic undercurrent draws heavily from ancient mythological traditions, reinterpreted through a modern cinematic lens. One of the central themes of the film is identity and self-discovery. Perseus, portrayed by Sam Worthington, begins the story unaware of his divine origin. His journey is not only physical but existential, as he gradually learns that he is the son of Zeus. This revelation forces him into a conflict between two identities, mortal upbringing versus divine heritage. The tension between these two aspects of self reflects a broader human experience of searching for meaning, belonging, and purpose. In mythological terms, demigods often represent the bridge between human limitation and divine potential, and Perseus embodies this duality throughout the film. Closely tied to identity is the theme of rejection and abandonment. Perseus' initial hatred toward the gods stems from the destruction of his adoptive family, an event caused indirectly by divine intervention. This establishes a psychological conflict where the hero must reconcile personal trauma with cosmic-scale forces. Zeus, played by Liam Neeson, represents distant authority and paternal absence, while Hades, played by Ralph Fiennes, represents betrayal from within the divine order. Together, they symbolize fractured parentage and dysfunctional divine hierarchy, mirroring human emotional conflict projected onto gods. Another major theme is a relationship between fear and power. Hades' rise and influence is directly tied to humanity's fear of death and the unknown. Unlike Zeus, who draws strength from worship and devotion, Hades thrives on terror. This thematic contrast suggests that power structures can be sustained either through reverence or intimidation. In the context of the film, fear becomes a currency that reshapes divine politics. The Kraken itself serves as a manifestation of ultimate fear, a physical embodiment of annihilation used to control mortals through threat rather than faith. The film also explores fate versus free will, a classic motif in Greek mythology. The gods often speak in terms of destiny and inevitability, suggesting that mortal lives are predetermined. However, Perseus consistently resists this notion by choosing action over submission. His refusal to accept a passive role in prophecy reflects a human desire for autonomy. Even when confronted with divine forces and prophetic warnings, he asserts agency through decision-making and sacrifice. This tension between predetermined fate and self-directed action forms the philosophical backbone of the story. A key symbolic element in the film is light versus darkness, often represented through visual and narrative contrasts. Zeus and the Olympian gods are associated with celestial light, order, and structure, while Hades is associated with shadow, underworld imagery, and decay. However, the film complicates this binary by portraying Zeus as distant and flawed, rather than purely benevolent. This suggests that light is not inherently moral, just as darkness is not inherently evil. Instead, both represent different aspects of divine power and control. The journey into the lair of Medusa is one of the most symbolically rich sequences in the film. Medusa herself represents forbidden knowledge, danger, and transformation through perception. Her gaze turns living beings into stone, symbolizing the paralysis that comes from confronting absolute truth or mortality. Perseus' strategy of using reflection rather than direct confrontation symbolizes indirect understanding and intellectual adaptation. The act of defeating Medusa without looking at her directly reflects the idea that some truths must be approached carefully, mediated through tools, wisdom, or distance. The head of Medusa becomes another major symbol after her defeat. It represents power over death, transformation, and the ability to turn destruction back onto itself. When Perseus uses it against the Kraken, it symbolizes humanity's ability to harness forbidden or dangerous knowledge for survival. However, it also raises ethical questions about the use of such power, suggesting that victory often comes at the cost of engaging with dangerous forces. The Kraken itself symbolizes uncontrollable natural or divine catastrophe. It is not merely a monster, but a force of judgment and annihilation. Its release represents the collapse of balance between gods and mortals. In a broader symbolic sense, it can be interpreted as a consequence of divine conflict spilling into the mortal world. Its defeat does not eliminate the underlying tensions among the gods, suggesting that chaos is suppressed rather than resolved. Another recurring symbolic idea is sacrifice. Throughout the film, characters are repeatedly faced with decisions involving personal loss for collective survival. Princess Andromeda represents sacrificial innocence, as her intended death is meant to appease divine forces. Perseus' journey itself is framed by repeated sacrifices of comfort, safety, and emotional attachment. These acts reinforce the idea that heroism in mythological narratives is inseparable from loss. The gods themselves function as symbols of human systems of authority. Zeus, Hades, and the Olympian hierarchy can be interpreted as representations of political and social structures, where power is concentrated above and imposed below. Their emotional conflicts reflect the instability of leadership when driven by pride, jealousy, and fear. In this sense, the film uses mythology as an allegory for governance and control. Ultimately, the film's symbolism revolves around the idea of balance between gods and humans, light and darkness, fate and free will, fear and faith. The narrative constantly returns to the need for equilibrium. When this balance is disrupted, chaos emerges in the form of monsters, divine conflict, and human suffering. Perseus' journey can therefore be understood as an attempt to restore equilibrium, not only in the physical world, but within himself. In conclusion, Clash of the Titans uses its mythological framework to explore timeless themes through accessible blockbuster storytelling. Its symbols are drawn from ancient mythology but reinterpreted for a modern audience, creating a narrative that blends spectacle with philosophical reflection on identity, power, and the nature of control. Clash of the Titans 2010 is defined visually by its hybrid approach to classical epic filmmaking and modern digital spectacle. The film exists at a transitional moment in Hollywood cinema, where traditional on-location photography and practical set design were increasingly being replaced or augmented by extensive computer-generated environments. As a result, the visual style of the film is not only an artistic choice, but also a reflection of technological change within the industry. The overall cinematographic approach is characterized by a dark, desaturated color palette. Many scenes are dominated by tones of gray, brown, and muted blue, creating a world that feels harsh, weathered, and mythically ancient. This visual decision reinforces the idea of a world in decline, where gods and humans are disconnected and natural harmony has been disrupted. The lack of vibrant color also helps unify the film's extensive CGI environments with live-action footage, creating a consistent atmospheric tone across digitally constructed landscapes. The film's visual identity is heavily shaped by director Louis Leterrier, whose background in action cinema influenced the dynamic and fast-paced camera work. Leterrier favors kinetic movement, rapid framing shifts, and a sense of urgency in action sequences. This results in a visual rhythm that prioritizes energy over stillness, often placing the camera in motion during combat scenes and creature encounters. The intention is to make the audience feel embedded within the chaos of mythological battles rather than observing them from a distance. One of the defining features of cinematography is the extensive use of digital environments. Entire landscapes, including cliffs, temples, underworld realms, and divine spaces, were constructed using CGI. This allowed the filmmakers to create mythological geography that could not exist in reality. However, it also introduced challenges in maintaining spatial coherence and visual clarity. Because many environments were added in post-production, lighting consistency and depth perception had to be carefully managed to avoid flattening the image or disconnecting actors from their surroundings. The integration of live-action footage with digital effects required precise coordination between cinematographers, visual effects supervisors, and production designers. Actors often performed in minimal physical sets surrounded by green screen stages. This meant that framing and composition had to be planned in advance using storyboards and pre-visualization tools. Camera movement was frequently designed with the future CGI environment in mind, ensuring that digital elements will align correctly with actor positioning and perspective lines. Action sequences in the film are particularly notable for their rapid editing style and dynamic camera angles. Combat scenes are often filmed with handheld or stabilized motion rigs that simulate instability and urgency. This approach enhances the feeling of chaos during battles, but also contributes to the criticism that some sequences lack visual clarity. The rapid cutting style reflects a broader trend in 2000s and early 2010s action filmmaking, where intensity was often prioritized over spatial readability. Creature design plays a major role in the film's cinematographic impact. The Kraken, Medusa, and giant scorpions are rendered with high levels of detail and scale, designed to dominate the frame whenever they appear. These creatures are often introduced with dramatic lighting contrasts, emerging from shadows or bright environmental backlighting to emphasize their scale and menace. The cinematography frequently positions human characters at extreme distances or low angles relative to these creatures, reinforcing their vulnerability. Lighting design throughout the film tends toward high contrast and low naturalism. Many scenes use stylized lighting rather than realistic environmental illumination. Divine characters, particularly Zeus and Hades, are often associated with dramatic directional lighting that emphasizes facial structure and emotional intensity. Zeus, played by Liam Neeson, is frequently shown with soft celestial light, while Hades, played by Ralph Fiennes, is often framed with darker, more fragmented lighting patterns that suggest instability and menace. The film also makes significant use of scale contrast as a visual storytelling technique. Human characters are frequently framed against vast environments or towering divine figures, emphasizing their relative insignificance within the mythological hierarchy. Wide shots are used to establish the grandeur of landscapes, while close-ups are reserved for emotional moments or moments of decision. This alternating scale helps balance the epic scope of the story with individual character focus. Another important aspect of the cinematography is the depiction of movement through space. Travel sequences, such as journeys across deserts or into underworld regions, are often shown with sweeping camera movements that suggest progression through a living mythological world. These transitions help connect episodic narrative sections and maintain visual continuity across diverse settings. The film's visual effects pipeline also significantly influenced framing decisions. Because many elements were added digitally, the cinematography had to accommodate compositing requirements. This sometimes resulted in static framing during complex effects shots to ensure stability for post-production layering. At other times, dynamic camera motion was carefully tracked so that CGI elements could be integrated seamlessly into moving shots. Color grading in post-production further defined the film's visual identity. The final image was adjusted to emphasize cool tones, muted highlights, and shadow depth. This grading contributed to the mythological atmosphere, but also reduced visual contrast in some scenes, leading to a more uniform but less varied visual experience. The decision reflects an attempt to unify practical and digital elements under a cohesive aesthetic. Costume and set interaction with lighting is another subtle but important aspect of the cinematography. Armor, fabrics, and weapons were designed to reflect light in ways that would remain readable against CGI backgrounds. Metallic surfaces were often treated with controlled reflectivity to avoid overexposure or blending into backgrounds. This technical consideration ensured that characters remained visually distinct within heavily digital environments. The 3D conversion process also influenced cinematographic perception. Although the film was not originally shot in native 3D, depth was artificially created in post-production. This affected how layers of foreground, midground, and background were separated. In some sequences, this enhanced the sense of scale, particularly in creature shots, while in others it contributed to a flatter visual impression due to time constraints in conversion. Clash of the Titans, 2010, uses its musical score and sound design as essential storytelling tools, shaping the emotional tone, reinforcing mythological scale, and amplifying the intensity of its action sequences. In a film so heavily driven by visual effects and digital environments, sound becomes one of the primary elements that ground the audience in physical sensation and emotional immersion. The combination of orchestral scoring, layered sound effects, and atmospheric audio design works together to create a world that feels vast, ancient, and often overwhelming. The musical score is composed by Ramin Djawadi, a composer known for his ability to blend traditional orchestral writing with modern rhythmic intensity. Before this film, Djawadi had already gained attention for his work on Iron Man, where he demonstrated a strong command of heroic themes and driving percussion. In Clash of the Titans, he expands this approach to suit a mythological setting, creating a score that emphasizes grandeur, tension, and emotional struggle rather than purely technological heroism. One of the defining characteristics of the soundtrack is its use of heavy percussion and rhythmic propulsion. Large drum sections are frequently used to underline moments of action, travel, and confrontation. These rhythmic patterns create a sense of inevitability, as if the story itself is being driven forward by forces larger than the characters. The percussion often mirrors the film's thematic focus on fate, conflict, and divine power, reinforcing the idea that events are in motion beyond human control. In contrast to the percussive intensity, the score also incorporates sweeping orchestral melodies that represent emotional and divine elements. Strings and brass are used to evoke both tragedy and heroism, particularly in scenes involving Perseus' internal conflict and his relationship to his divine heritage. These melodic sections are often more restrained, providing contrast to the more aggressive action cues. This dual structure reflects the film's balance between intimate human emotion and large-scale mythological spectacle. The sound design of the film is equally important in establishing its immersive quality. Creature sounds, environmental audio, and combat effects are all carefully layered to create a sense of tangible presence. The Kraken, for example, is accompanied by deep, resonant sonic textures that emphasize its immense size and otherworldly nature. These sounds are designed not only to be heard but to be felt, using low-frequency audio to create physical impact in theater environments. The depiction of Medusa also relies heavily on sound to enhance her visual threat. Her movements are accompanied by subtle ambient cues, such as shifting stone textures, serpentine motion sounds, and faint environmental distortions. These auditory details reinforce her supernatural ability to turn living beings into stone, suggesting that even proximity to her is dangerous. The sound design ensures that her presence is felt even before she is fully visible on screen. Combat sequences are constructed with layered sound effects that emphasize impact, weight, and spatial orientation. Swords clashing, armor breaking, and creatures moving through environments are all given distinct sonic identities. Rather than relying solely on realism, the sound design often exaggerates certain elements to enhance dramatic effect. This includes amplified weapon strikes and enhanced environmental reverberation during large-scale battles. Environmental sound plays a major role in establishing the mythological setting. Winds across barren landscapes, echoes within cavernous underworld spaces, and the distant rumble of divine activity contribute to the film's atmosphere. These ambient layers help differentiate locations and provide auditory cues that guide the audience through complex visual environments. The soundscape often compensates for the visual density of CGI environments by adding depth and spatial awareness. The voice performances of the gods are also a critical component of the sound design. Liam Neeson as Zeus delivers dialogue with deep, resonant authority that emphasizes divine power and emotional burden. Ralph Fiennes as Hades uses a more fractured, darker vocal tone that reflects instability and resentment. These vocal differences help define the ideological contrast between the two gods, making their conflict not only visual but auditory. Silence is used strategically throughout the film to heighten tension. In key moments before major confrontations, the score often drops away, leaving minimal ambient sound. This absence of music creates anticipation and allows sudden sound re-entry during action beats to have greater impact. The contrast between silence and explosive sound reinforces the unpredictability of divine intervention and monster encounters. The integration of sound with visual effects is particularly important in a film where much of the imagery did not exist during principal photography. Sound designers had to create audio elements that matched creatures and environments added later in post-production. This required close collaboration between visual effects teams and audio engineers to ensure synchronization between movement, scale, and sonic identity. The 3D release of the film also influenced sound mixing decisions. Although 3D primarily affects visual perception, the filmmakers enhanced spatial audio cues to complement the sense of depth. Directional sound placement was used to reinforce off-screen action and create a more immersive viewing experience. This includes positioning creature sounds and environmental effects within a three-dimensional auditory field. Overall, the soundtrack and sound design of Clash of the Titans function as essential narrative components that elevate the film beyond its visual spectacle. Ramin Djawadi's score provides emotional structure and mythological grandeur, while the sound design adds physical weight and immersive realism to the world. Together, They transform a film into an experience that is not only seen but felt, reinforcing its themes of divine power, human struggle, and epic confrontation. Clash of the Titans 2010 was released into a highly competitive and rapidly evolving cinematic landscape, where audience expectations for blockbuster filmmaking were being reshaped by advancements in visual effects, narrative complexity, and the growing influence of global franchise cinema. The film's reception reflects a strong divide between commercial performance and critical evaluation, with audiences showing moderate enthusiasm, while critics largely expressed disappointment regarding its storytelling, visual execution, and rushed production decisions. From a commercial standpoint, the film performed strongly at the global box office. Its appeal was driven by several factors, including its recognizable mythological subject matter, the presence of well-known actors such as Sam Worthington, Liam Neeson, and Ralph Fiennes, and the growing popularity of large-scale fantasy spectacles in the early 2010s. Audiences were drawn to its promise of epic battles, gods, and monsters, all presented through modern CGI technology. The film's financial success demonstrated that mythological fantasy remained a commercially viable genre even when critical reception was mixed. Critically, however, the film received a predominantly negative response upon release. Many reviewers criticized its narrative structure, describing the story as overly simplistic and heavily reliant on exposition rather than character-driven development. While the film followed a recognizable hero's journey framework, critics argued that it lacked emotional depth and failed to fully develop its supporting characters. The pacing was often described as uneven, with rapid transitions between major plot points leaving little room for thematic exploration or audience investment in secondary arcs. Another major point of criticism was the visual style, particularly the post-production 3D conversion. Many critics and viewers felt that the conversion process diminished image clarity and reduced the impact of action sequences. Instead of enhancing immersion, the 3D effect was frequently described as flat or unnecessary. This decision became a focal point in discussions about the overuse of post-converted 3D in Hollywood during that period. The film is often cited in industry conversations as an example of how rushed technological implementation can negatively affect audience experience. The CGI quality itself also received mixed responses. While some praised the scale and ambition of the creature design and mythological environments, others criticized the inconsistency in visual effects integration. Certain scenes were noted for strong creature rendering and dynamic composition, while others appeared less cohesive, particularly in sequences with heavy compositing or fast camera movement. This inconsistency contributed to perception that the film prioritized quantity of effects over refinement. Audience reactions were generally more positive than critical reviews, though still divided. Many viewers appreciated the film as a straightforward action fantasy experience, valuing its entertainment factor and mythological themes. The film's emphasis on spectacle over narrative complexity resonated with audiences seeking escapist entertainment. However, even among general viewers, there was acknowledgement that the story felt rushed and that character development was limited. The performances of the main cast received mixed but often respectful commentary. Sam Worthington was seen as a physically fitting but emotionally restrained lead, with some critics noting a lack of expressive range, while others appreciated his understated approach. Liam Neeson and Ralph Fiennes were widely praised for bringing gravitas and intensity to their respective roles, even when the script did not fully support nuanced character development. The film also faced criticism for its screenplay and dialogue. Many reviewers described the writing as functional rather than inspired, serving primarily to move the plot forward rather than to explore deeper emotional or philosophical ideas. Expository dialogue was frequently used to explain mythological context, which some critics felt reduced a sense of mystery and discovery that could have been more effectively conveyed through visual storytelling. Despite its criticisms, the film did receive recognition for its ambition and scale. Some reviewers acknowledged that it successfully delivered large-scale mythological spectacle and that it contributed to the continued popularity of fantasy adventure films. Its commitment to visual grandeur and creature-based action sequences was seen as a strength, even when narrative execution was considered lacking. The release of Clash of the Titans also sparked broader industry discussion about production practices in blockbuster filmmaking. The rushed 3D conversion became a cautionary example, influencing how studios approached post-production decisions in subsequent years. Filmmakers and critics alike debated the balance between commercial pressure and artistic quality, particularly in high-budget genre films where visual effects timelines are tightly constrained. In retrospect, the film is often categorized as a transitional blockbuster. It represents a moment when Hollywood was experimenting with new technologies and production strategies, but had not yet fully refined their implementation. As a result, its reception is inseparable from its historical context, reflecting both audience appetite for mythological spectacle and critical frustration with uneven execution. Clash of the Titans, 2010, occupies a distinct position in modern blockbuster history, not necessarily as a critically celebrated landmark, but as an influential transitional film that reflects shifting industry standards in visual effects, franchise filmmaking, and mythological adaptation. Its legacy is shaped less by narrative innovation and more by its role in accelerating certain trends in Hollywood production, particularly in the early 2010s. One of the most important aspects of its legacy is its contribution to the continued popularity of mythological fantasy films. While earlier films such as 300 had already demonstrated commercial interest in stylized ancient world narratives, Clash of the Titans reinforced the idea that Greek mythology could be repeatedly mined as a foundation for large-scale cinematic universes. Following its release, studios continued to develop myth-inspired projects, including Immortals and other sword and sorcery-style productions. The film helped maintain the visibility of mythological storytelling in mainstream cinema during a period dominated by superhero franchises. The film also influenced how Hollywood approached 3D conversion practices. Because Clash of the Titans underwent a post-production 3D conversion under a very tight schedule, it became widely discussed as an example of rushed technological adaptation. In the years that followed, studios became more cautious about converting films into 3D after principal photography. The industry gradually shifted toward either native 3D production or improved post-conversion pipelines with longer development timelines. In this sense, the film indirectly contributed to improving production standards by highlighting the limitations of rushed implementation. Another part of its legacy lies in its visual effects methodology. The film was produced during a period when CGI was becoming the dominant tool for large-scale world building. Clash of the Titans demonstrated both the potential and the risks of heavily digital filmmaking. Its depiction of mythological creatures like the Kraken and Medusa showed how far visual effect technology had progressed in terms of scale and detail. At the same time, inconsistencies in integration and lighting highlighted the challenges of blending live-action performance with fully digital environments. This duality made the film a reference point in discussions about CGI-driven storytelling. The performances of the cast also contributed to its long-term recognition. Actors such as Sam Worthington, Liam Neeson, and Ralph Fiennes maintained strong careers after the film, and their involvement helped keep it visible in discussions of early 2010s fantasy cinema. While the film itself did not define their careers, it is often referenced as part of their broader work in genre filmmaking during that period. In terms of influence on storytelling, the film reinforced a particular structure for mythological action films: a lone hero discovering divine heritage, a looming apocalyptic threat, a journey through episodic monster encounters, and a final confrontation involving a powerful artifact or divine weapon. This structure, while not unique to the film, was popularized further through its mainstream visibility and was echoed in subsequent fantasy and adventure productions. The film also contributed to the evolving depiction of gods in modern cinema. Instead of distant, abstract deities, Clash of the Titans presented gods as emotionally flawed, politically conflicted beings. Zeus and Hades function not only as divine figures, but also as symbolic representations of authority, rebellion, and emotional trauma. This more humanized portrayal of gods influenced later fantasy storytelling, where mythological or divine characters are often given psychological depth and interpersonal conflict. Merchandising and ancillary media related to film were relatively limited compared to major franchise properties, but its visual designs, particularly of creatures and armor, influenced concept art and fantasy illustration trends in the early 2010s. The aesthetic of dark and mythological realism, with heavily armored warriors and shadowy divine figures, became a recognizable style in fantasy media during this era. In video game culture, while the film itself did not directly spawn major adaptations, It exists alongside a growing interest in mythological gaming experiences. Titles like God of War continue to dominate the space, but Clash of the Titans reinforced public familiarity with Greek myth imagery, helping sustain audience interest in similar narratives across interactive media. Another aspect of its legacy is its role in shaping audience expectations for blockbuster pacing. The film's fast-moving structure, which prioritizes continuous escalation over slower character development, became increasingly common in action fantasy cinema. While this approach was not new, Clash of the Titans exemplified it in a highly visible way, contributing to ongoing debates about the balance between spectacle and storytelling depth. In academic and film criticism discussions, Clash of the Titans is often used as a case study in early digital blockbuster filmmaking. It represented a moment when studios were still learning how to integrate large-scale CGI, post-conversion 3D, and globalized production pipelines into cohesive storytelling. As such, its legacy is as much industrial as it is artistic. In conclusion, the legacy of Clash of the Titans is defined by its influence on industry practices, visual effects development, and mythological fantasy trends rather than critical acclaim. It stands as a marker of a transitional era in Hollywood, where ambition and technological experimentation pushed filmmaking forward, even when narrative execution remained uneven. Its impact continues to be felt in how studios approach large-scale fantasy storytelling and visual effects integration today. Clash of the Titans 2010 generated a wide range of audience reactions that reflected not only the film itself, but also the broader expectations viewers had for fantasy cinema during the early 2010s. Audience interpretation of the film was shaped by individual viewing context, familiarity with Greek mythology, and evolving standards for visual effects-driven blockbuster entertainment. As a result, the film became something of a divided experience, where entertainment value and narrative depth were often weighed differently depending on the viewer. For many general audiences, the film was primarily experienced as a spectacle-driven adventure. Viewers who approached it expecting action, monsters, and mythological conflict often found it to be engaging on a surface level. The presence of large-scale battles, divine beings, and iconic creatures, such as a Kraken, provided a sense of grandeur and excitement. In this interpretation, the film functioned as escapist entertainment, offering a temporary immersion into a world of gods and heroes that contrasted with everyday reality. However, audience members who were more familiar with classical mythology or who expected a more faithful adaptation of Greek myth often expressed disappointment. The film's streamlined narrative, altered character relationships, and condensed mythological elements led some viewers to feel that the richness of the original stories was reduced in favor of action-oriented pacing. This tension between adaptation and reinterpretation became a common theme in audience discussions, particularly in online forums and early social media spaces. The performance of Sam Worthington as Perseus played a significant role in shaping audience perception of the film's emotional core. Some viewers appreciated his portrayal as stoic and determined, interpreting his restrained emotional expression as fitting for a demigod burdened by trauma and identity conflict. Others, however, felt that the emotional distance limited their ability to connect deeply with the character. This divergence highlights how audience expectations for heroic protagonists can vary widely, especially in genre films that blend mythological themes with modern action sensibilities. The portrayal of divine characters, particularly Zeus and Hades, also influenced audience interpretation. Performances by Liam Neeson and Ralph Fiennes were often cited as highlights, with many viewers appreciating the gravitas they brought to their roles. For some audiences, these characters represented the most compelling aspect of the film, as their ideological conflict added a layer of political and emotional tension that elevated the story beyond simple monster hunting. Audience reactions to the visual effects were mixed but passionate. Many viewers were impressed by the scale of the creatures and environments, especially when experienced in cinema settings. The Kraken, in particular, left a strong impression as a symbol of overwhelming power. However, some audiences also noticed inconsistencies in CGI quality or felt that rapid camera movement made action sequences difficult to follow. These contrasting reactions reflect the evolving expectations of digital effects at the time, when audiences were becoming increasingly familiar with high-quality CGI from other major franchises. The film also resonated differently across age groups. Younger viewers and those less familiar with classical mythology often embrace it as a fast-paced fantasy adventure, while older audiences or mythology enthusiasts tended to focus more critically on narrative structure and adaptation choices. This generational divide is common in mythological adaptations, where source material carries both educational and cultural expectations. Another important aspect of audience reflection is the way the film contributed to discussions about heroism. Perseus' journey, centered on discovering identity and choosing between divine and mortal existence, was interpreted by some viewers as a metaphor for self-determination. His rejection of divine authority in favor of human life was seen as an affirmation of personal agency. Others interpreted his character arc as underdeveloped, suggesting that the thematic potential of his journey was not fully explored on screen. The films released during a period of economic uncertainty also influenced audience reception. For some viewers, the mythological escapism provided a welcome distraction from real-world concerns. The depiction of gods, monsters, and epic quests allowed audiences to temporarily disengage from contemporary anxieties. This escapist function is often an important but overlooked aspect of blockbuster reception, especially during periods of global instability. Online audience discussions played a growing role in shaping the film's reputation. Early 2010s forums, review aggregators, and emerging social media platforms allowed viewers to share opinions rapidly and widely. These discussions often highlighted specific criticisms, such as pacing issues or visual inconsistencies, while also defending the film's entertainment value. Over time, this collective discourse contributed to a stable but divided consensus. The film was enjoyable but flawed. Repeated viewings also influenced audience interpretation. Some viewers who initially focused on spectacle began to notice thematic elements related to fate, divine politics, and identity. Others who initially criticized the film's simplicity found appreciation in its straightforward narrative structure when revisited without high expectations. This evolution in perception is common for blockbuster films that prioritize immediate impact over layered storytelling. In conclusion, audience reflection on Clash of the Titans reveals a film that functions differently depending on viewer expectations. It succeeds as a visual spectacle and mythological adventure for many, while also provoking critique regarding narrative depth and adaptation choices. Its interpretation is shaped by generational perspective, mythological familiarity, and evolving standards for blockbuster cinema, making a film whose audience reception is as layered and varied as the mythology it attempts to depict. Clash of the Titans, 2010, structures its narrative around a central hero's journey, with character development driven primarily by external conflict, mythological revelation, and gradual shifts in identity rather than deeply layered interpersonal subplots. While the film emphasizes spectacle and pacing, it still constructs distinct character arcs that reflect its core themes of fate, divinity, and human agency. The most significant character arc belongs to Perseus, played by Sam Worthington. At the beginning of the film, Perseus exists in a state of human identity without knowledge of his divine origin. He is shaped by loss, having been raised by a mortal family and later witnessing their destruction. This trauma defines his initial motivation, rejection of the gods and resistance to anything associated with divine authority. His arc begins as a journey of vengeance and denial. As the story progresses, Perseus undergoes a gradual transformation through exposure to truth and mythological reality. The revelation that he is the son of Zeus introduces an internal conflict between hatred of the gods and the discovery of his own divine heritage. This moment marks a turning point in his development, shifting his motivation from pure revenge toward understanding and reluctant acceptance of responsibility. However, Perseus never fully embraces divine identity as superiority. Instead, he interprets it as burden and duty. Throughout the narrative, Perseus transitions from reactive survivor to active decision-maker. Early in the film, he is largely driven by external events, responding to loss and divine interference. Later, he becomes the one making strategic choices, seeking out knowledge, confronting mythological challenges, and ultimately deciding how to use divine tools, such as the head of Medusa. His final decision to reject full integration into the divine world and remain among humanity completes his arc of self-defined identity. The character of Zeus, played by Liam Neeson, follows a more restrained and static arc, functioning primarily as a symbol of divine authority rather than undergoing dramatic transformation. Zeus begins the film as a powerful but emotionally distant ruler of the gods. His conflict with Hades reveals a fractured leadership structure rather than a personal journey of growth. Over the course of the film, Zeus is forced to confront the consequences of divine neglect and the fragility of the balance between gods and humans. Zeus' arc is less about change and more about recognition. He comes to understand the extent of Hades' manipulation and the unintended consequences of divine interference in mortal affairs. However, he ultimately reasserts control rather than fundamentally changing his governing philosophy. This positions Zeus as a representation of established power that adapts only enough to preserve balance rather than undergo transformation. Hades, portrayed by Ralph Fiennes, represents a more emotionally driven antagonist arc. Unlike Zeus, Hades is motivated by resentment and a sense of abandonment. His transformation is rooted in a perception of being cast out and undervalued by both gods and humans. This emotional foundation drives his actions throughout the film, particularly his manipulation of fear to gain power. Hades' arc is defined by escalation rather than resolution. As he gains influence through fear and the threat of the Kraken, he becomes increasingly unstable and consumed by his desire for recognition and power. However, his arc does not culminate in redemption or enlightenment. Instead, it ends in defeat and reaffirmation of the divine hierarchy that rejected him. In this sense, Hades functions as a cautionary figure about the corrosive effects of resentment and isolation. The supporting character Draco, played by Mads Mikkelsen, represents discipline, loyalty, and structured human resistance. His arc is more subtle than Perseus, but still meaningful within the group dynamic. Draco begins as a rigid military leader focused on duty and order. Over time, he is forced to adapt to mythological realities that defy traditional human warfare. His willingness to follow Perseus into increasingly supernatural challenges reflects a gradual expansion of belief and trust beyond conventional logic. Io, portrayed by Gemma Arterton, functions as both guide and emotional anchor. Her arc is shaped by endurance and burden, as she carries knowledge and experience across time due to her mortal condition. Io begins as a distant, almost attached figure, but gradually reveals emotional investment in Perseus' journey. Her character development is less about transformation and more about release, as she ultimately finds resolution in the completion of Perseus' quest and the restoration of balance. Andromeda, played by Alexa Davalos, represents a more traditional narrative function within the hero's journey structure. Her arc is limited by the film's focus on action and mythological progression, but she still embodies the concept of sacrificial innocence and political consequence. As a figure marked for sacrifice, her character highlights the stakes of divine manipulation in human society. While her development is not deeply explored, she serves as a symbolic endpoint for Perseus' mission to prevent unnecessary destruction. The interplay between these characters emphasizes different responses to divine power and fate. Perseus challenges it, Zeus manages it, Hades corrupts it, Draco adapts to it, Io observes it, and Andromeda is subjected to it. This structural distribution of roles reinforces the film's thematic framework, where each character represents a different perspective on the relationship between mortals and gods. Clash of the Titans 2010 presents a visual world that blends ancient mythological inspiration with stylized cinematic reinterpretation. Because the film relies heavily on computer-generated environments, costumes and physical set pieces play an especially important role in grounding characters in a tangible reality. The costume and set design work together to create a sense of a lived-in ancient world, while also accommodating the demands of large-scale visual effects integration. The overall design philosophy of the film's costumes is rooted in a fusion of classical antiquity and dark fantasy aesthetics. Rather than attempting strict historical accuracy, the designers focus on creating armor, garments, and textures that evoke a mythological past while still being visually readable in fast-paced action sequences. Materials such as leather, bronze, and weathered fabric dominate the visual palette, reinforcing the idea of a harsh, battle-driven world shaped by divine conflict. Perseus, portrayed by Sam Worthington, is outfitted in progressively more heroic armor as the story develops. Early in the film, his clothing is simple and functional, reflecting his identity as a fisherman and reluctant participant in divine affairs. As he transitions into a mythological hero, his armor becomes more structured and symbolic, incorporating metallic elements that suggest both protection and destiny. This gradual evolution in costume design visually reinforces his transformation from mortal to demigod hero. The gods are distinguished through costume design that emphasizes both power and separation from humanity. Zeus, played by Liam Neeson, is often depicted in flowing robes and regal garments that combine classical Greek inspiration with cinematic exaggeration. His attire is designed to convey authority and divine majesty, while also allowing for expressive movement and lighting effects. The use of lighter tones and reflective surfaces helps visually separate him from darker environments, reinforcing his association with celestial order. In contrast, Hades, portrayed by Ralph Fiennes, is designed with more fragmented and ominous aesthetic. His costume incorporates darker fabrics, layered textures, and elements that appear almost eroded or unstable. This visual approach reflects his thematic association with the underworld, decay, and resentment. Subtle visual effects are integrated into his appearance, such as smoky or shadow-like extensions, enhancing his supernatural presence without overwhelming the physical costume design. Supporting characters, such as Draco, played by Mads Mikkelsen, are designed to reflect military discipline and human resilience. His armor is practical and utilitarian, emphasizing function over ornamentation. This contrasts with the more symbolic designs of divine characters, reinforcing the distinction between mortal structure and divine chaos. The worn textures and battle marks on his armor suggest long-term survival in a harsh environment shaped by both human and supernatural threats. Io, portrayed by Gemma Arterton, is visually distinguished through a more ethereal design approach. Her costumes often incorporate lighter fabrics and flowing elements that suggest movement beyond normal human constraints. Because her character exists between mortal and immortal states, her design reflects ambiguity, neither fully grounded in the human world nor entirely divine. This visual duality supports her narrative role as a guide between realms. Andromeda, played by Alexa Davalos, is presented through regal but restrained costume design. As a princess marked for sacrifice, her clothing reflects both nobility and vulnerability. The design avoids excessive ornamentation, instead focusing on elegance that contrasts with the brutality of the surrounding world. This helps reinforce her role as a symbolic figure of innocence within a collapsing political and divine system. Set design in the film is heavily influenced by the need to integrate physical environments with extensive CGI backgrounds. Many sets were constructed as partial structures, such as palace interiors, temples, and rocky platforms, which were then extended digitally into vast landscapes. This hybrid approach allowed actors to interact with real surfaces and props while still inhabiting mythological environments that extend beyond physical limitations. The city of Argos, one of the central human locations in the film, is designed as a densely built ancient settlement with stone architecture, elevated structures, and large public gathering spaces. Its design emphasizes vulnerability in the face of divine threat, particularly as it becomes the focal point of the Kraken's impending destruction. The architecture reflects both cultural sophistication and impending doom, reinforcing the tension between human achievement and divine judgment. Divine environments, particularly Olympus, are designed with a more abstract and elevated aesthetic. These spaces often feature monumental architecture, glowing atmospheric effects, and vast open spaces that suggest separation from the mortal world. Olympus is not depicted as a historically grounded location, but rather as a symbolic realm of authority and distance, reinforcing the god's detachment from human suffering. The underworld, associated with Hades, is designed using darker, more oppressive visual language. Rock formations, shadow-heavy environments, and unstable lighting conditions create a sense of confinement and unease. This contrasts sharply with the openness of Olympus and the grounded nature of human cities, visually reinforcing the film's thematic division between realms. Prop design also plays a significant role in world building. Weapons such as swords, shields, and spears are crafted to appear both functional and mythologically significant. The head of Medusa, one of the most important narrative artifacts, is designed with a balance of horror and reverence, ensuring that it feels both dangerous and symbolically powerful. Clash of the Titans 2010 presents a screenplay that is primarily functional in structure, designed to support a fast-paced mythological adventure rather than a dialogue-driven dramatic narrative. The script prioritizes clarity of plot exposition of mythological concepts, and momentum between action sequences. As a result, the dialogue often serves a direct narrative purpose, moving characters from one event to the next while reinforcing the central themes of divine conflict, identity, and fate. The screenplay focuses heavily on exposition, particularly in its early and middle sections. Because the story involves gods, demigods, monsters, and ancient mythology, much of the dialogue is used to explain relationships, motivations, and mythological rules. Characters frequently articulate information that helps the audience understand the stakes of the conflict, such as the weakening of the gods, the rise of Hades, and the threat of the Kraken. While this ensures narrative clarity, it also reduces opportunities for subtle character interaction or ambiguous storytelling. The dialogue spoken by Perseus, portrayed by Sam Worthington, is intentionally restrained and emotionally controlled. His lines are often short, direct, and focus on action or immediate goals. This reflects his character's internal state, which is defined by trauma, loss, and reluctant acceptance of his role as a demigod. However, this minimalism in dialogue also limits expressive range, making his emotional development more reliant on visual performance and plot progression than verbal expression. The divine characters provide some of the most thematically loaded dialogue in the film. Zeus, played by Liam Neeson, speaks with a tone of authority and paternal concern. His dialogue often reflects themes of responsibility, distance, and the burden of leadership. Zeus functions as both a mythological figure and a symbolic representation of power that is emotionally detached yet structurally essential. His lines are designed to sound weighty and declarative, reinforcing his status as ruler of the gods. Hades, portrayed by Ralph Fiennes, delivers dialogue that is more emotionally charged and psychologically driven. His speech often contains undertones of resentment, manipulation, and existential frustration. Unlike Zeus, who speaks in terms of order and balance, Hades often frames his dialogue around fear, control, and punishment. This contrast in language style reinforces the ideological divide between the two gods and adds tension to their interactions. One of the key characteristics of the screenplay is its reliance on direct motivational dialogue. Characters frequently state their intentions aloud, such as seeking vengeance, protecting humanity, or fulfilling divine will. While this approach ensures accessibility, it reduces ambiguity and limits opportunities for layered interpretation. The script favors immediacy over subtext, which aligns with its action-oriented structure, but sacrifices some narrative subtlety. The supporting characters, including Draco played by Mads Mikkelsen, Io played by Gemma Arterton, and Andromeda played by Alexa Davalos, contribute dialogue that primarily serves relational and informational purposes. Draco's speech reflects discipline and military structure. Io's dialogue often carries mythological insight or emotional guidance, and Andromeda's lines are centered around political consequence and sacrifice. None of these characters are given extensive monologue-driven arcs, which reflects the film's emphasis on Perseus as the central narrative focus. Despite its functional nature, the script does contain moments of memorable phrasing and thematic emphasis. The most notable example is a recurring invocation of mythological power and divine authority, often expressed through declarative statements about gods, monsters, and fate. These lines are designed to sound epic and archetypal rather than conversational, contributing to the film's mythological tone. However, one of the most commonly discussed aspects of the script is its lack of distinctive voice across characters outside of Zeus and Hades. Many human characters share similar speech patterns, which can make dialogue exchanges feel uniform. This reflects a broader production priority of pacing over individuality, where clarity and speed of storytelling take precedence over deeply differentiated character voices. The pacing of dialogue is tightly linked to the film's editing style. Conversations are often short and quickly interrupted by action transitions or scene changes. This creates a rhythm where dialogue functions as connective tissue between set pieces rather than as extended dramatic exploration. As a result, emotional beats are frequently compressed, and character reflection is often externalized through action rather than speech. The screenplay also uses dialogue to reinforce mythological stakes in a simplified manner. Concepts such as divine hierarchy, underworld power, and prophetic fate are explained in direct terms rather than gradually revealed. While this ensures that audiences unfamiliar with Greek mythology can follow the story, it also reduces narrative mystery and limits interpretive depth. In conclusion, the dialogue and script writing of Clash of the Titans are characterized by clarity, efficiency, and functional storytelling. While the screenplay effectively supports the film's fast-paced mythological structure, it does so at the expense of linguistic richness and character-driven dialogue complexity. The result is a script that prioritizes narrative movement and spectacle integration over verbal artistry, or deep conversational development. The marketing and promotional campaign for Clash of the Titans 2010 was designed around positioning the film as a large-scale mythological blockbuster event, emphasizing spectacle, modern visual effects, and recognizable fantasy imagery. The promotional strategy reflected the broader Hollywood trend of the late 2000s and early 2010s, where films were increasingly marketed as global cinematic experiences rather than standalone stories. The campaign focused heavily on gods, monsters, and epic destruction, using these elements to attract audiences seeking high-intensity fantasy entertainment. The studio behind the film, Warner Brothers, played a central role in shaping the marketing direction. At the time, Warner Brothers was heavily invested in large-scale franchise filmmaking and high-concept visual spectacles. The marketing team positioned Clash of the Titans as both a modern remake of the 1981 original and a reimagining of Greek mythology for contemporary audiences. This dual identity allowed the campaign to appeal both to viewers familiar with the original film and to new audiences drawn to fantasy action cinema. One of the most prominent elements of the marketing campaign was its emphasis on visual spectacle in trailers and television spots. Early promotional trailers focused almost entirely on fast-paced imagery. The Kraken rising from the sea, battles with mythological creatures, and dramatic confrontations between gods. Dialogue was minimal in these trailers, reflecting a strategy that prioritized visual impact over narrative explanation. This approach was intended to communicate the film's scale instantly, ensuring that audiences associated it with large cinematic experiences rather than character-driven drama. The presence of well-known actors was also a key marketing asset. The promotion material frequently highlighted Sam Worthington as a central hero figure, leveraging his rising popularity following his role in Avatar. His image was used to represent the modern action hero archetype, physically capable, emotionally restrained, and embedded in a visually immersive world. Similarly, promotional campaigns emphasized the involvement of Liam Neeson and Ralph Fiennes, whose reputations as serious dramatic actors added credibility and gravitas to the fantasy narrative. The marketing of the gods themselves was particularly important. Zeus and Hades were framed as opposing cosmic forces, with promotional materials highlighting their ideological conflict. This positioning helped elevate the film beyond a simple monster adventure, presenting it as a story about divine power struggles. Posters and trailers often emphasize glowing celestial imagery for Zeus and shadow-heavy, ominous visuals for Hades, creating a clear visual dichotomy that audiences could immediately recognize. The Kraken became a central icon of the marketing campaign. As one of the most visually striking elements of the film, it was used extensively in promotional imagery, teaser posters, and trailers. The creature's scale and destructive power were emphasized to communicate the stakes of the story. The phrase, "release the Kraken," originally associated with earlier mythology-inspired storytelling, became strongly linked with the film's promotional identity. This phrase achieved notable cultural visibility and was widely repeated in advertising materials, helping to establish a memorable marketing hook. A significant aspect of the promotional strategy involved the use of 3D as a selling point. During the film's production and marketing cycle, the success of Avatar had dramatically increased audience interest in three-dimensional cinema. Clash of the Titans was therefore marketed as a 3D spectacle, even though the conversion occurred in post-production. Advertising materials highlighted the immersive nature of the experience, encouraging audiences to view the film in premium formats. This positioning was intended to justify higher ticket prices and differentiate the film from standard fantasy releases. However, the emphasis on 3D also became a controversial aspect of its marketing. While promotional campaigns suggested a deeply immersive visual experience, the final product received criticism for inconsistent 3D quality due to its accelerated conversion process. This gap between marketing promise and audience perception became part of the film's broader reputation and contributed to industry discussions about the risks of overselling post-production enhancements. Television advertising and online promotional campaigns were also heavily utilized. Shortened trailers and clips were distributed across broadcast networks, emphasizing action sequences and creature encounters. The marketing tone remained consistent across platforms, focusing on urgency, destruction, and mythological grandeur. Digital platforms were increasingly important at the time, and the film's online presence included interactive trailers, featurettes about visual effects, and behind-the-scenes promotional content showcasing CGI development. The poster design for Clash of the Titans followed a minimalist but iconic structure. Central imagery often featured Perseus, portrayed by Sam Worthington, standing in heroic pose against a backdrop of destruction or mythological chaos. The Kraken or other monstrous elements were frequently positioned in the background, reinforcing the idea of overwhelming threat. The color palette of promotional materials mirrored the film's visual tone, using dark blues, grays, and metallic highlights to convey a sense of epic seriousness. International marketing campaigns adapted the film's imagery to different cultural contexts, but the core themes remain consistent. Mythological imagery has global recognizability, which made the film particularly suitable for international promotion. The gods, monsters, and heroic journey structure translated easily across markets, allowing Warner Bros. To maintain a unified global branding strategy. Merchandising for the film was relatively limited compared to major franchise properties, but promotional tie materials still included collectible items, action figures, and branded artwork based on key creatures and characters. The Kraken and Medusa were particularly emphasized in these materials due to their strong visual identities. These elements helped extend the film's presence beyond theaters, reinforcing its fantasy world in consumer spaces. The promotional campaign also relied heavily on the reputation of director Louis Leterrier, who was presented as a modern action filmmaker capable of delivering high-energy cinematic experiences. His previous work was referenced in interviews and featurettes to establish continuity in his directorial style and to reassure audiences of the film's action-driven quality. Clash of the Titans 2010 can be best understood in relation to other mythological films, earlier adaptations of the same source material, and contemporary fantasy blockbusters of its era. Its identity is shaped not only by what it attempts to do, but also by how it differs from, reacts to, and parallels other works in the same cinematic space. Through comparison, the film reveals its strengths, limitations, and its place within the broader evolution of mythological and fantasy cinema. The most direct comparison is with the original Clash of the Titans, 1981, a film known for its practical effects created by legendary visual effects artist Ray Harryhausen. The 1981 version relied heavily on stop-motion animation, physical models, and handcrafted creature effects. This gave the original film a tangible, handcrafted aesthetic that emphasized artistry and mythological charm over realism. In contrast, the 2010 version replaces this physical artistry with fully digital creatures and environments. While the remake offers greater scale and fluid motion, it sacrifices some of the tactile texture that defined the original. The comparison highlights a broader shift in cinema from analog craftsmanship to digital construction. Another important comparison is with 300 2006, directed by Zack Snyder. Both films draw from ancient mythological or historical material and stylize it through heightened visual aesthetics. However, 300 embraces a highly stylized, graphic novel-inspired visual language with strong color contrast and slow-motion choreography. Clash of the Titans, on the other hand, opts for a more grounded but digitally saturated realism. Where 300 feels like a stylized mythic illustration, Clash of the Titans attempts to simulate a real mythological world using CGI. This difference reflects two competing approaches to myth adaptation: stylization versus simulated realism. A further comparison can be made with Immortals 2011, which also explores Greek mythology through a visually stylized lens. Immortals leans heavily into artistic composition, surreal imagery, and heightened color design. Compared to this, Clash of the Titans appears more restrained and conventional in its visual presentation. While both films feature gods, monsters, and epic battles, Immortals prioritizes aesthetic experimentation, whereas Clash of the Titans prioritizes mainstream accessibility and rapid pacing. When compared to other films featuring mythological or fantastical journeys, such as the Harry Potter series or the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Clash of the Titans reveals differences in narrative depth and world building. The Lord of the Rings films, for example, invest heavily in linguistic detail, cultural history, and character-driven storytelling across extended runtimes. Clash of the Titans, by contrast, compresses its narrative into a fast-paced structure that prioritizes episodic encounters over deep exploration of its world. Similarly, Harry Potter balances magical spectacle with long-form character development, whereas Clash of the Titans focuses primarily on immediate mythological conflict. The film can also be compared to early superhero cinema of the same period, particularly films within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like these superhero films, Clash of the Titans features a protagonist discovering hidden abilities and confronting larger-than-life antagonists. However, superhero films typically emphasize character humor, emotional relatability, and serialized storytelling. Clash of the Titans instead maintains a more mythic and serious tone, with minimal humor and a more episodic adventure structure. This tonal difference highlights the film's closer alignment with ancient epic storytelling rather than modern superhero franchise conventions. In relation to director Louis Leterrier's other works, particularly The Incredible Hulk, 2008, similarities can be observed in pacing and action choreography. Both films feature protagonists caught between human identity and extraordinary power, as well as a strong emphasis on pursuit, confrontation, and transformation through conflict. However, Clash of the Titans expands this approach into a fully mythological framework, replacing scientific or experimental origins with divine lineage and ancient prophecy. The performances of the main cast, including Sam Worthington, Liam Neeson, and Ralph Fiennes, can also be compared to their roles in other genre films. Worthington's portrayal of Perseus shares similarities with his role in Avatar, particularly in terms of emotional restraint and reluctant heroism. Neeson's Zeus can be compared to his roles in other authority figures across action cinema, where he often embodies moral seriousness and commanding presence. Fiennes' Hades aligns with his recurring pattern of portraying complex antagonists who blend intellectual sophistication with emotional instability. From a thematic standpoint, Clash of the Titans differs from many fantasy epics in its limited focus on political systems or extended world building. While films like The Lord of the Rings explore multiple civilizations and languages, Clash of the Titans remains tightly centered on divine human conflict. This makes it more myth-centric than world-centric, meaning it prioritizes archetypal storytelling over expansive fictional history. Technologically, the film can be compared to other early 2010 CGI-heavy productions that experimented with post-production 3D conversion. In this category, it shares similarities with films that attempted to capitalize on new viewing formats without fully integrating them during production. This places it within a transitional technological phase where studios were still learning how to balance digital effects ambition with production planning. In conclusion, the comparative analysis of Clash of the Titans reveals a film positioned between eras and styles. It stands between practical effects and digital cinema, between classical myth adaptation and modern franchise filmmaking, and between stylized fantasy and simulated realism. While it may not surpass other landmark fantasy films in narrative depth or visual innovation, it remains a significant example of early 21st century attempts to reinterpret mythology through evolving cinematic technology and mainstream blockbuster structure.